Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into, well, you sent this over. It's fascinating stuff. India's SFDRR Midterm Review Voluntary National Report. So we're going to try and unpack this for everybody, kind of give a guided tour, basically extract the key insights for folks who, want to understand India's strategies for disaster risk reduction, their achievements so far, and what they're still grappling with. Kind of like a crash course, but a thorough one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment in time to be looking at this because this report, this midterm review, really marks a crucial halfway point, not just for the Sendai framework itself, but for a whole constellation of global development goals that were agreed upon back in 2015. So it's a great opportunity to kind of look back, take stock, and see what's working, what's not, and where the focus needs to be for the rest of the journey towards 2030.
Right, and just to give folks some context, this is all built around the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the SFDRR, which is this global blueprint for reducing disaster risk that runs from 2015 to 2030. And India, a signatory to that framework, is deeply committed to it.
And it's worth sort of stepping back and appreciating just how vulnerable India is to a whole range of disasters. I mean, the report itself lays this out very clearly. It's a country with a huge diversity of landscapes and climates, a massive and growing population, very rapid urbanization, industrial growth, environmental degradation, and of course, the increasing impacts of climate change. All of these factors combine to create a really broad spectrum of risks that India faces. We're talking earthquakes, floods, cyclones, droughts, landslides, you name it. And that's before we even get into disasters caused by human activity. So it's a very complex risk landscape to navigate.
It really is. And steering all of these disaster management efforts is the National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA. So this is India's apex body for disaster management. And their guiding document is the National Disaster Management Plan, or NDMP. We should also mention the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda on DRR, which was announced in 2016. This lays out a really clear vision for disaster risk reduction, very much in line with the SFDR's priorities.
And this midterm review that you sent over is so important because it's India's chance to kind of do a self-assessment, take a look at how much progress they've made, identify the gaps where they've fallen short, and then really chart the course for what needs to be done to achieve those SFDR goals by 2030. I mean, as you mentioned, 2023 marked the midpoint for a whole lot of these global frameworks, right? The ones that were agreed upon back in 2015. So it's a real turning point.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into the specifics here. And let's start with priority one of the SFDRR, which is understanding disaster risk. The report really underlines how committed India is to understanding its disaster risk. And one of the key things that it highlights is the Vulnerability Atlas of India. This atlas has been around since 1997, but they released a new version in 2019, which incorporates data from the 2011 census. And this has created this really, really comprehensive disaster risk map. The key takeaway for folks is that India is investing heavily in understanding exactly where and why it's vulnerable to disasters.
Yeah. What's really striking to me about this vulnerability atlas is how it's evolved over time. Starting back in 97 and being continuously updated and revised shows that there's a real commitment to getting a finer and finer grained understanding of vulnerabilities across the entire country. And including the 2011 census data in the latest version, allowed them to build a much more nuanced picture of the risks. For example, they've developed these district-level housing vulnerability risk tables, which look at different types of wall and roof construction. Think about how a house with mud walls and a thatched roof might fare in an earthquake versus a house built from reinforced concrete. That's the level of detail they're getting into here.
Right. And to make all of this data truly useful, the Building Materials and Technology Promotion Council and the School of Planning and Architecture, they've actually developed an online training program because it's not enough just to collect all this data. You really need to make sure that it gets into the hands of the people who can actually act on it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Making sure that this knowledge, this understanding of risk actually translates into concrete actions on the ground. It's a really crucial point. And the report also highlights the development of the satellite-based All India Flood-Affected Area Atlas and the Landslide Atlas. These were both released in 2023 by the National Remote Sensing Center and the NDMA. And this, to me, feels like a pretty major advancement in their capabilities. So for your listeners, I think the key takeaway here is that India is really leveraging cutting-edge technology, specifically satellite data, to map and understand these very specific hazards on a national scale.
Yeah. For the Flood Atlas, they actually used a ton of historical satellite imagery going all the way back to 1998 and right up to 2022. And crucially, they didn't just rely on the satellite data. They actually validated all of that information with ground data that was collected by disaster management authorities. So they combined the satellite imagery with the ground truthing. And what this does is it gives them a much more reliable and accurate picture to work with when it comes to planning for flood mitigation, at different levels. And then the landslide atlas, that provides what's called susceptibility zonation. So it shows which areas are most susceptible to landslides. And it provides this really granular district level information on risk exposure.
It's really impressive how they're combining these sophisticated technologies like satellite imaging with that essential ground level verification. They're not just taking what the satellites tell them at face value. They're making sure that it actually corresponds with what's happening on the ground. And that kind of multi-layered approach, I think, gives them a much more robust and actionable understanding of these particular risks.
Yeah. The report also touches on some of the monitoring systems that India has in place for other types of hazards. So, for example, they have the National Agricultural Drought Assessment and Monitoring System that provides near real-time information on droughts. And then they have the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program, or IDSP, which helps to detect disease outbreaks early on. They even use data from the IDSP after the 2018 Kerala floods to help with their response. So the takeaway here for your listeners is that India's understanding of disaster risk, it goes beyond just, the initial hazard event itself. It also includes an understanding of the potential secondary impacts, things like disease outbreaks that can often follow in the wake of a disaster.
Yeah. These are great examples of how understanding disaster risk isn't just about predicting when and where the initial hazard event's going to happen. It's also about anticipating those knock-on effects, those things that happen in the aftermath, like a disease spreading after a major flood. And that kind of understanding is so important for mounting a truly comprehensive response and for building long-term resilience.
Right. And then there's this national level geospatial database and decision support tool that India has developed, which is called NDM 4.0. And this sounds like an incredibly powerful tool. It basically helps with everything from hazard analysis and damage assessment to preparedness and response planning. So think of it like a one-stop shop for all kinds of critical information that's needed for disaster management.
Exactly. And the sheer range of services that it provides is pretty amazing. So it includes things like meteorological services, information on cloud movement, rainfall forecasts, predictions of heat waves and cold waves, lightning alerts, thunderstorm warnings, flood forecasts, sea state forecasts, information on the location of forest fires, landslide alerts, details about earthquake events. I mean, the list goes on. It's really quite comprehensive. And having all of this data integrated into this single platform, I think, gives disaster managers a much clearer and more holistic view of the situation, and that allows them to make much more informed and effective decisions.
Yeah, it really does. And then for monitoring specific threats, they also have a network of over 150 earthquake monitoring stations and a long-range lightning detection sensor network that boasts an accuracy rate of over 98% within a radius of 300 kilometers. They also have a really cool app called Damini. It's a lightning alert app that was developed by IATM in 2020. This app uses data from over 75 sensors across the country to alert users about lightning strikes within a 40 square kilometer area. So it's like it's getting that vital information directly to the people who need it the most.
Yeah, the Damini app is a fantastic example of how technology can be used to directly empower individuals and communities who are at risk. And the report also goes on to highlight some of the work that ISRO is doing through its disaster management support program. They're leveraging a lot of satellite data through their platforms like Bhuvan and Mosday. And then there's NCOIS, which is using India's Navy's satellite navigation system to send out alerts about cyclones and high waves. So it's really this convergence of scientific and technological capabilities being applied to disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, and the India Meteorological Department, or IMD, has also made some really significant improvements to its cyclone forecasting capabilities in recent years. And this has thankfully led to a really big reduction in the number of deaths caused by cyclones. They even include a case study in the report on Cyclone Gaja, which hit Tamil Nadu in 2018. And this case study actually shows how effective the TNS-MART tool and the early warning dissemination systems were in saving lives. So it's really a testament to the fact that these investments in better understanding and monitoring disaster risk, they really do pay off. They also have a case study on Assam's flood reporting and information management system, which shows how systematically collecting data at the local level can really inform decision making and improve flood preparedness.
Those case studies are so valuable because they really bring the data and the strategies to life, or they show you the real world impact of these investments in understanding and monitoring disaster risk.
Yeah.
I mean, that contrast in mortality rates between, say, the 2004 tsunami and Cyclone Gaja, which you just mentioned, is really stark. And it really underlines just how important those early warning systems are and how effective they can be when they're done right.
Absolutely. So let's move on to priority 2 now, which is strengthening disaster risk governance. And the report really stresses how much India has invested in robust risk governance mechanisms. It all starts with the Disaster Management Act of 2005, which laid down the institutional structure for disaster management at all levels, from the national level all the way down to the local level. So the key takeaway here for your listeners is that India has a really strong legal and institutional framework in place for managing disaster risk.
Yeah, that act was a real watershed moment, I think, for India. It marked a decisive shift from a reactive approach to disaster management to a much more proactive one. And that's really reflected in the establishment of, the NDMA in 2005, which we've already talked about, and then the National Policy for Disaster Management, which came out in 2009. So it was a real turning point.
And building on that foundation, they have the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda for DRR, which was announced in 2016. And this provides a really clear set of goals that are very closely aligned with the SFDRR's priorities.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just a top-down system, right? So in addition to the NDMA at the national level, India also has these state disaster management authorities, the SDMAs, and then the district disaster management authorities, the DDMAs. So it's a genuinely multi-level system of governance for disaster risk reduction that reaches all the way down to the local level.
Right. And the National Disaster Management Plan, which was formulated in 2016 and then revised in 2019, that aligns with the SFDRR. And it now specifically addresses biological and public health disasters, which is, particularly relevant in light of recent events globally. The NDMA also coordinates closely with all the different ministries, and there's actually a mandate for every ministry to develop its own disaster management plan. So this mainstreaming of DRR, I think that's a key insight for your listeners. It's not just one agency's job. It's really everyone's responsibility.
Yeah, that's such an important point, this idea of mainstreaming disaster risk reduction. So it means that, managing disaster risk isn't just siloed within a single agency, but it's actually woven into the planning and the operational fabric of all different sectors of government. And the report actually notes that a lot of state governments have made really good progress in strengthening their own disaster risk governance and in empowering local governments to take a more proactive role.
Right. And the NDMA actually has a dedicated program to support state-level disaster management authorities in implementing the SFDRR's priorities, which includes providing them with dedicated human resources. And of course, we can't forget about the National Disaster Response Force, the NDRF, which provides those specialized teams for responding to disasters across the country.
Yeah. The NDRF has really become a very visible and important part of India's disaster response capabilities. The report also highlights the really critical role of the National Institute of Disaster Management, the NIDM. They're doing a lot of work in areas like capacity building, training, research, and policy advocacy. So this institute is really key to building that core expertise that's needed for effective disaster risk governance.
Yeah, absolutely. And India's commitment to tackling climate change is also really important here. They have their National Action Plan on Climate Change, the NAPCC, and then individual states also have their own state action plans on climate change. And they're very active in international partnerships like the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI. So the key takeaway here for your listeners is that India very much sees climate action as an integral part of disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, and those international collaborations are becoming increasingly vital, I think, as climate change really intensifies disaster risks across the globe. The CDRI, in particular, I think is a great example of India's leadership in promoting disaster resilient infrastructure, not just within its own borders, but on a global scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the money side of things now. How is all of this, funded? So the report actually lays out India's disaster financing system, which, thanks to the Disaster Management Act of 2005, includes both disaster response funds and disaster mitigation funds at various highest levels. And these funds are actually allocated independently of the annual budget. So they're not subject to, the same kind of budgetary constraints. And this seems like a really significant step towards making sure that the money is there when it's needed. So the key insight for folks is this move towards dedicated and more predictable disaster funding.
Yeah, it's crucial, I think, to create a more reliable and predictable source of funding for these disaster management activities rather than having to sort of scramble and find the money after a disaster has already struck. The report also mentions a number of national programs that are specifically aimed at reducing the risks from specific hazards. So we're talking things like lightning, coastal and river erosion, urban flooding and fires, including forest fires. And there's a real mix of structural measures, like building seawalls or strengthening embankments, alongside things like early warning systems and community awareness programs.
Right. And there's a really big emphasis on getting communities involved, both through, local programming and by encouraging volunteerism. And a good example of this is the Dapta Mitra scheme, which is a program that trains community volunteers in disaster response. They've already trained something like a lakh of volunteers across 30 flood-prone districts in 25 states, and they have plans to expand this to 350 vulnerable districts across the country. So for your listeners, I think the insight here is that there's a real recognition of the crucial role that local communities play in disaster response.
Yep, absolutely.
Empowering people at the local level to act as first responders is often a really effective strategy because, those volunteers they're often in the best position to provide that immediate assistance to people who are affected by a disaster. And the report also highlights the importance of long-term training and capacity building programs, with NIDM sort of serving as the leading center of excellence for disaster risk reduction in the country. And they've also developed a number of resources like the India Disaster Knowledge Network and the India Disaster Resource Network.
And bringing different stakeholders together is also a real priority. They have this national platform for disaster risk reduction, the NPDRR, which provides a space for government agencies, community groups, researchers, businesses, and other stakeholders to come together and work collaboratively on disaster risk reduction. The report actually points to the really strong collaboration that was seen during the COVID-19 pandemic as an example of how effective this multi-stakeholder approach can be. So the key takeaway here, I think, is the real value of a coordinated and a multi-sector approach to disaster risk governance.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of collaborative approach is so important because it allows for a much more holistic understanding of the risks and a much more joined up response. And the report also talks about India's efforts on both climate change mitigation and adaptation. So they've got their commitments that they made at COP26, things like reaching net zero emissions, the Mission Life Initiative, and then they also have those climate action plans at the state and local levels that we mentioned earlier.
Right. And with India's really extensive coastline, they're also paying a lot of attention to the risks facing, marine and coastal areas. So they have a draft national policy on the blue economy that's currently in development. And they also launched this really cool initiative called Mission Mishti in 2023, which stands for Mangrove Initiative for Shoreline Habitats and Tangible Incomes. And this initiative is really all about conserving and restoring mangrove forests along the coast. So it kind of highlights that focus on protecting these really vulnerable coastal ecosystems.
Yeah, those initiatives show a real awareness of the very specific vulnerabilities of coastal regions and the really important role that natural environments play in building resilience against coastal hazards like storm surges and sea level rise. Mm-hmm. The case studies that are included in this section of the report are also really interesting. So they look at the role of disaster management institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then they also look at some of the efforts of local governments in disaster planning in states like Kerala, Odisha, and Uttar Pradesh, and then some of the work that's being done on landslide risk mitigation in Aizawl, which is the capital of Mizoram.
Yeah, the case studies are really great because they make the discussion a lot more concrete, right? They show how these governance structures and these plans are actually put into practice and the real impact that they have on how well communities can withstand disasters.
Yeah, sure. So moving on now to priority 3, which is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. And the report here really underscores the government's recognition that they need a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach to disaster risk reduction. And this means integrating risk reduction into all sorts of different sectors, things like infrastructure, education, agriculture, urban development, the environment, health, you name it. So the key takeaway here, I think, is that there's a real move towards integrating disaster resilience into all aspects of development planning and implementation.
Right. And this commitment to investing in resilience, it's not just words. They've actually backed it up with a pretty dramatic increase in the annual budget allocation for disaster management. So over the past 8 years, the annual budget for disaster management has increased by a whopping 122%. So that's a pretty substantial investment.
It certainly sends a very strong signal about the priority that's being given to disaster risk reduction. And the Finance Commission also plays a really important role here. So they're the ones who recommend, how financial resources should be distributed and what kind of measures need to be taken for DRR. And that includes things like allocating grants for disaster risk reduction and the creation of the National Disaster Risk Management Fund, the NDRMF, and then the State Disaster Risk Management Fund, the SDRMF. These funds were actually set up for the period from 2021-22 to 2025-26.
Right. And even the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, has gotten involved. They've issued guidelines for banks to incorporate disaster risk reduction measures into their lending practices. So they're actually encouraging banks to think about the potential risks from disasters when they're making lending decisions. And this is really interesting, I think, because it shows how disaster resilience is kind of being factored into financial decision making at all levels now.
Yeah. It's a great example of how disaster risk reduction is really being seen as relevant across the entire financial system and not just within, government agencies that are specifically tasked with disaster management. And the report also talks about, policies that are aimed at making infrastructure more resilient. Mm-hmm. So they're looking at, the vulnerabilities that are introduced by new infrastructure projects, and they're setting special standards for lifeline buildings, those buildings that are absolutely essential for communities to function, things like hospitals and power plants.
Right. And then, of course, there's the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI, which India launched back in 2019. And this has really grown into a major international partnership that's focused on making infrastructure systems all around the world more resilient to disasters. So the takeaway here, I think, is India's real leadership in promoting this idea of global infrastructure resilience.
Yeah. The rapid growth of the CDRI and its focus on providing technical support, building capacity, conducting research, and advocating for resilient infrastructure really highlights India's leadership in this really crucial area. And the report also goes on to talk about some of the work that's being done to improve health resilience. So this includes things like a commitment to One Health approaches, which recognize the interconnectedness of human health, animal health, and environmental health. They also have the National Action Plan for Containment of Antimicrobial Resistance, which came out in 2017. And there's been a really push to revamp health infrastructure in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the Prahan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, or Ayushman Bharat, which was launched in 2018, is a really important part of this. So this program provides health insurance coverage to something like 500 million people, who are among the most vulnerable segments of Indian society.
Right. And those social safety net programs that India has in place, those play a really important role in building resilience as well, because they address some of those underlying social and economic vulnerabilities that can make people more susceptible to the impacts of disasters. So things like the public distribution system, which is the world's largest food-based safety net, reaching over 800 million people. The National Food Security Act, and they have a digitally enabled public distribution system now, which is a really interesting development. And then the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, MGNREGA, that provides guaranteed employment, and that can be a real lifeline for people in the aftermath of a disaster. And then they also have various pension schemes and insurance schemes that can help to provide a safety net. So these programs are a key insight into how India supports its most vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. These programs provide a really vital safety net, helping people to cope with and recover from shocks of all kinds, including those that are caused by disasters. And the report also touches on the National Schools Safety Policy, which was formulated in 2016. This policy aims to create safer learning environments for children. And they've been implementing school safety programs in a number of different states across the country.
Right. And then they also have a whole host of region and hazard specific measures that are aimed at addressing, everything from drought to urban flooding, to seismic activities, to landslides, to erosion. And a lot of these measures are financially supported by the National Disaster Mitigation Fund. And they continue to invest in things like urban development, technology, and innovation, risk assessment, and capacity building. So some good examples of this are the National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Project and the Optimitra project that we mentioned earlier. So these targeted investments are really key insight into how India is taking a localized approach to building resilience.
Yeah, it's great to see those kind of focused investments being made alongside the broader policy initiatives, and it really demonstrates, I think, a comprehensive approach to building resilience across different sectors and different parts of the country. The case studies in this section of the report are also really great. They highlight how food insecurity was reduced during the COVID-19 pandemic through the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. And then they also look at some of the initiatives that are aimed at disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. So things like the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 2016, and some of the really great work that's being done in Kerala to make sure that people with disabilities are fully included in disaster risk reduction efforts.
Yeah, those case studies are really powerful because they really highlight the importance of having inclusive strategies and providing targeted support to make sure that all segments of society are becoming more resilient to disasters.
Absolutely. So let's move on now to priority 4, which is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better. And the report here emphasizes the importance of promoting a culture of safety and awareness. And they're doing this through various government programs that involve communities and schools. So the key insight here, I think, is a really proactive focus on preparedness.
Right. And there's been a lot of investment in critical infrastructure, things like cyclone shelters, flood protection embankments, and early warning systems. And the report highlights the progress that's been made in multi-hazard early warning dissemination and evacuation mechanisms, pointing to the reduction in the number of deaths caused by recent cyclones like Cyclone Fani and Cyclone Amphan. They've also adopted the post-disaster needs assessment, the PD&A methodology at both the national and subnational levels to ensure a more holistic approach to recovery. So these improvements in infrastructure and in planning, that's a really vital takeaway for folks.
Yeah, the advancements in early warning systems and that resulting decrease in the loss of life from cyclones is a really major achievement. And the PD&A methodology provides a really structured way to assess needs after a disaster and to plan for a more effective recovery process. And of course, the report also highlights the role of the National Disaster Response Force, the NDRF, which we've already talked about. They describe it as the quote, single largest dedicated disaster response force, end quote, in the world. It has 16 battalions spread across the country. And they've also been raising state disaster response forces, the SDRFs, in all of the states and union territories.
Right. And the NDRF is clearly a vital asset. And the fact that they established this NDRF Academy in Nagpur, that really shows a commitment to ongoing training and professional development within the NDRF. India's approach to Build Back Better, or BPB, which is laid out in the report, it uses these India post-disaster needs assessment tools, and it prioritizes things like livelihood restoration and the restoration of essential services. But it does so while also aiming to enhance resilience. So it's not just about putting things back the way they were. It's about building back stronger, and that focus on building back better. I think that's a key insight for folks.
Yeah, it's a really important shift in thinking, right? That recovery isn't just about restoring things to the way that they were before, but it's about actually seizing that opportunity to create more resilient communities and more resilient infrastructure. The report also talks about that 3-tiered system that India has for responding to disasters. So at the apex level, you have the NDRF. At the state level, you have the SDRFs. And then at the district level, you have things like civil defense, home guards, and fire and emergency services.
Right. And some of the key SFDRR initiatives that are highlighted in this section are the strengthening of SDMA and DDMA scheme, which was launched in 2019, and the strengthening of DDMAs in 115 hazard-prone aspirational districts. They also have this National Disaster Management Information System, the NDMIS, which is used for capturing information on the damages and losses caused by disasters and for monitoring how funds are being dispersed. So I think this system is a key insight into how India is managing its disaster-related data and resources.
Yeah, the NDMIS is a crucial tool for data-driven disaster management. It allows them to really get a clear picture of the impacts of disasters and to make sure that the resources are being allocated efficiently and effectively. And the report also talks about the many training and capacity building programs that are being implemented at various levels. They've even set up a National Disaster Response Academy, the NDRA, in Nagpur.
And there was a national workshop on data requirements for a disaster risk reduction database that was held back in 2018, which was really all about creating a more integrated disaster database for the country. And the report also really emphasizes India's emerging leadership in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or HADR, at global level. And this is all guided by the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the whole world is one family in Sanskrit. They participated in multilateral exercises like PanX 21, which was organized by BIMSTEC, and SMANBay 22, which was organized by ASEAN. So this global leadership in HADR, that's a key takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. India's increasing involvement in HADR really reflects its commitment to international cooperation and its growing capabilities in disaster management. And the report lists a number of specific actions that have been taken under this priority. Things like training a lack of community volunteers under the APTA Mitra scheme, the strategic deployment of NDRF battalions across the country, the fact that they conduct these regular mock exercises to test their preparedness, the school safety program, the common alerting protocol, which is used to send out early warnings, the establishment of these NGO coordination centers, and then, of course, the National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Project, the NCRMP, which covers 8 coastal states and union territories. And they actually go into some detail about the objectives and the components of the NCRMP. They also talk about the long-term training and capacity building study and the importance of things like basic facilities in reducing people's vulnerability to disasters. They even mentioned this IMS paper that credits India with ending extreme poverty. And they highlight some of the programs that have contributed to that, things like the MEDRA, Yojana, and Stand Up India, which are aimed at promoting entrepreneurship and financial inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they also highlight a couple of really specific initiatives. So they have this common alerting protocol-based integrated alert system, which is called Sachet Phase 1, which is used to disseminate these geo-targeted early warnings to people who are in